This audiobook is brought to you by the Paladin Learn History app. There is a face that every American knows before they know almost anything else. It appears on the penny, on the $5 bill, on the walls of elementary school classrooms and government buildings and the chambers of institutions that would not exist without the decisions he made. It has been carved into a mountain in South Dakota at a scale that makes it visible from miles away, and it sits at the end of the National Mall in Washington, in a temple built deliberately to suggest the presence of something sacred, something that belongs to a category above the ordinary category of political leader or historical figure. The face is gaunt, the cheekbones are prominent, the eyes deeply set, the expression carrying something that looks, depending on the light and the angle and your own state of mind when you are looking at it, either like sorrow or like patience or like some combination of the two that does not have a clean name in English or perhaps in any language. It is the face of Abraham Lincoln. And tonight we are going to try to find the person underneath it, not the monument, not the great emancipator, the title that history assigned him and that he would have found both flattering and incomplete, and probably somewhat beside the point of how he understood his own work. Not the marble president sitting in his temple at the end of the mall, larger than life in the literal sense that the statue is 19 feet tall and would dwarf the actual man who sat for the sculptor's study. Not the symbol that America has made of him, which is real and important, and which we will not dismiss, but which is also a layer of accumulated meaning placed over a human being who was considerably more complicated and considerably more interesting than any symbol can contain. The man who was born in a one-room log cabin in Kentucky in the winter of 1809 and who died in a boarding house bedroom in Washington in the spring of 1865, with a bullet in his brain and the most devastating war in American history technically won but not yet finished, and the question of what the winning would actually mean still entirely open. The man who walked between those two moments through a life of losses so comprehensive and so recurring that they would have broken most people who tried to carry them, and who carried them anyway, and who found in the carrying a quality of understanding and a capacity for compassion that shaped everything he did when he finally had the power to do things at the scale that power makes possible. To find that man, we have to start where all men start, not in the White House, not in the Illinois legislature or the law offices of Springfield, in a family, on a frontier, in the specific conditions of a specific childhood that formed the specific person who would eventually become the symbol. Kentucky, 1809, then Indiana, then Illinois. The frontier of the early American Republic was not the romantic landscape that later mythology would construct around it, all noble hardship and self-reliant virtue and the clarifying simplicity of life close to the land. It was simply hard. It was hard in the physical sense of unrelenting labor with inadequate tools in weather that did not accommodate human preferences about when to plant and when to harvest and when to simply stop and rest. It was hard in the economic sense of poverty that was not the occasional poverty of bad luck, but the structural poverty of people at the bottom of a social hierarchy that offered limited avenues for advancement regardless of how hard the people at the bottom worked. And it was hard in the emotional sense of loss, recurring and sometimes catastrophic loss, that the frontier extracted from families with a regularity that shaped the people who survived it in ways that are still visible in their descendants. Thomas Lincoln, Abraham's father, was not a bad man. This needs to be said clearly because the relationship between Abraham Lincoln and his father is one of the more complicated elements of the story, and the complications are sometimes resolved in Lincoln biography by making Thomas a villain, which he was not. He was a man of limited education and limited economic prospects who moved his family repeatedly in search of land and opportunity, and who found neither inadequate supply wherever he went. He was capable of physical affection toward his children. He was capable of humor, and the humor was something his son inherited and then developed into one of the primary instruments of his public and private life. He was also, by his son's later account, someone who did not understand or particularly value the intellectual hunger that was visible in Abraham from very early on, who saw reading and studying as a distraction from the work that needed to be done, rather than as the engine of the transformation that would eventually carry his son to places Thomas could not have imagined. Nancy Lincoln, Abraham's mother, died in the autumn of 1818. He was 9 years old. She died of milk sickness, a disease caused by drinking milk from cows that had eaten white snake root, a plant toxic to cattle that passed its toxins through the milk to the humans who drank it. The disease was poorly understood at the time. It had no effective treatment. It killed relatively quickly, and it killed several people in the Lincoln's Indiana community in the same season, including the aunt and uncle whose family, Abraham's family, had followed west. Nancy Lincoln's death was the first great loss of Abraham Lincoln's life, and it was complete in a way that left nothing to hold on to. She was there, and then she was not, and the log cabin that had been their home became, in her absence, something considerably grimmer. Thomas Lincoln was not equipped for single parenthood of 2 children on the frontier, not because of any particular failure of character, but because the conditions of frontier life in 1818 Indiana were not conditions that made single parenthood manageable for anyone. Sarah, Abraham's older sister, took on responsibilities that a girl of 11 should not have been required to take on. Abraham did what he could. The family survived the winter, which was itself an achievement under the circumstances. Thomas eventually remarried. His second wife was a widow named Sarah Bush Johnston, and what she brought to the Lincoln household when she arrived with her own children from her previous marriage was something more valuable than anything Thomas's struggling farm could produce. She brought warmth. She brought competence. She brought a quality of intelligent attention to the children in her new household that recognized what Abraham was and what he needed and gave him the support and the permission to pursue it. She saw him. Sarah Bush Lincoln looked at her stepson and understood that the hunger she saw in him, the relentless need to read and to learn and to understand, was not a distraction or a peculiarity or a problem to be managed, but a genuine gift of an exceptional order. She protected it. She encouraged it. When Thomas expressed impatience with Abraham's reading, Sarah interceded. When the demands of farm work threatened to consume every hour of daylight, Sarah found ways to create space in which the boy could open a book. Years later, long after Abraham Lincoln had become the most famous man in America, Sarah Bush Lincoln was still alive, an old woman in Illinois, and she spoke about her stepson with a combination of pride and something that sounds very much like genuine understanding. She said that he never gave her a cross word in his life. She said that she had a son of her own, and she loved Abraham no more than her own son, but she was certain that she had more influence over Abraham than over her biological son. She said she knew that Abraham would amount to something. She knew it because she saw it, and what she saw, the hunger for knowledge in a boy who had almost no access to it, who read every book he could find in a region where books were extremely scarce, who read by firelight after the day's work was done because the daylight hours were not his own, was the engine of everything that came after. The education that Abraham Lincoln received in the formal sense was, by any reasonable measure, almost nothing. He described it himself later as defective, amounting in total to less than a year of schooling, scattered across several brief periods when a teacher happened to be available in the community. The schools were subscription schools, meaning families paid a small fee for each child who attended, and the curriculum they offered was the bare minimum of literacy and arithmetic that would allow a child to function in the commercial world. What Lincoln received beyond this formal nothing was something more significant and more formative than any curriculum could have provided. He taught himself. He read everything he could find with a thoroughness and a retention that people around him found remarkable even at the time. The King James Bible, Aesop's Fables, John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, Mason Weems's biography of George Washington, the Revised Laws of Indiana, which he read partly because it was available and partly because even as a teenager something in him was drawn toward the structure and the logic of law. Shakespeare eventually, which became a lifelong passion of a depth and intensity that surprised people who assumed that a frontier-born prairie lawyer would have a merely passing acquaintance with the plays. He did not just read, he absorbed and transformed what he read. He practiced writing by copying passages from the books he had access to, and then by writing original pieces, essays and poems, and the beginnings of the comic writing style that would eventually make him one of the most effective communicators in American political life. He practiced speaking by delivering impromptu speeches to his fellow farmhands, standing on a tree stump in the field while his audience listened with a combination of amusement and genuine attention, because even then there was something in the way he organized a thought and delivered it that made people want to hear what came next. The humor was real, and it was not simply entertainment. It was functional. It was a way of making difficult things approachable and of diffusing tensions that would otherwise have hardened into conflict. And it was also, and this is the part that is sometimes overlooked, a coping mechanism, a way of bearing what would otherwise have been unbearable. The ability to find something laughable in a situation that was actually painful was not a way of denying the pain. It was a way of surviving it while the pain continued, which is a different thing entirely and a considerably more useful one. He was very tall, 6 feet 4 inches, which was exceptional in an era when average height was considerably less, and the height was not an abstraction but a daily physical fact. A body that did not fit easily into the spaces designed for ordinary-sized people, that had to duck through doorways and fold itself into chairs and wagons, and, eventually, into the carriage that carried him through Washington, and the boat that took him down the Mississippi, and all the other conveyances of a life that covered a great deal of physical territory. He was also, physically, extraordinarily strong. The work of the frontier built a body that was capable of things that impressed people who were themselves not weak. He could drive an axe with a precision and a force that made experienced woodsmen stop and watch. He could lift things that other men struggled to move. This physical capability was part of his social identity in the communities where he grew up, and it was part of the impression he made on people who were trying to figure out how to categorize him. This tall, ungainly, apparently awkward young man who turned out, when it came to things that required actual strength and skill, to be considerably more formidable than he looked. But the intelligence was always more formidable than the physical capability, and the intelligence was what was going to matter. He left home at 21, legally free to make his own way in the world, and what he found when he made his way to New Salem, Illinois, was a community small enough that his abilities stood out immediately and large enough to offer him the specific opportunity he needed. New Salem was a village of about 25 families on the Sangamon River, the kind of frontier settlement that was appearing all across the Midwest in the 1830s, some of which would grow into cities and some of which would simply disappear when the economic conditions that had called them into existence shifted or failed. New Salem would eventually fail and disappear, but while Lincoln lived there, it was alive enough to provide him with the social world in which he began to become himself. He worked various jobs. He ran a store that failed. He worked as a postmaster, which gave him access to newspapers from across the country, and which he used with the same appetite he brought to every other source of information, reading everything that came through the post office and understanding the country he was living in through the accumulated picture that the newspapers provided. He worked as a surveyor, learning the technical skills involved with the same thoroughness he brought to everything he studied. He served briefly in the militia during the Black Hawk War, an experience that he later described with rueful humor as involving a great deal of combat with mosquitoes. And he began studying law. He borrowed Blackstone's commentaries and read it, sitting under a tree when the weather was good and inside whenever it was not, with the same ferocious concentration that had characterized all his reading since childhood. He read it multiple times. He worked through the logic of the legal arguments and the structure of the legal system with the systematic intelligence that was by now his most distinctive characteristic, and what he found in law was what he had been looking for without quite knowing he was looking for it. A framework, a system of reasoning that was ordered and logical and that provided a structure within which the complexity of human conflict could be organized and addressed and at least sometimes resolved. He was admitted to the bar in 1836, and he moved to Springfield, the new state capital, in 1837. He had almost no money and borrowed a horse to make the journey. He arrived with everything he owned in his saddlebags and asked his eventual law partner, John Todd Stewart, if he could share his bed. Stewart said yes. The law practice that Lincoln built over the following years was not a spectacular or dramatically successful one by the standards that biography tends to apply to great men. It was a working practice, handling the ordinary legal business of central Illinois, property disputes and debt cases, and the small criminal matters that constituted the daily reality of frontier legal work. He rode the circuit, traveling from county seat to county seat with the judges and other lawyers who worked the same territory, sleeping in taverns and courtrooms and wherever there was a dry space to put a bedroll, arguing cases and socializing and telling stories around the evening fire in the particular world of the circuit rider that was one of the distinctive institutions of mid-19th century American life. He was a good lawyer, not universally successful because no lawyer is universally successful, but capable and well regarded by his colleagues and by the clients whose cases he handled. He had an ability to explain complex legal matters to juries in language that was clear and vivid, and that made the logic of the argument accessible to people who had no legal training. He had an ability to identify the essential point of a case and to focus the argument there rather than dissipating it across peripheral matters. And he had the humor, always the humor, which made him a distinctive presence in the courtrooms and taverns and public spaces of the circuit world, and which earned him a reputation that preceded him wherever he went. He also entered politics, serving in the Illinois state legislature beginning in 1834, and finding in the political world a different kind of arena for the abilities that the law was developing. The legislature required persuasion. It required the building of coalitions among people who had competing interests and who needed to be brought to agreement through argument and negotiation, and the careful management of relationships. Lincoln was good at this, though his early political career did not produce the dramatic results that biography tends to attribute to people who are headed for greatness. It produced the ordinary results of a capable politician in a complicated environment, modest achievements and frustrating setbacks, and the slow accumulation of experience that would eventually matter enormously. There was a woman named Anne Rutledge. She was the daughter of one of New Salem's founding families, and by all accounts she was intelligent and warm, and the kind of person who made the people around her better and happier simply by being present. Lincoln knew her during his New Salem years, and the evidence suggests that the relationship between them was significant in some way that went beyond ordinary friendship, though the exact nature of the relationship is one of the genuinely contested questions of Lincoln biography. She died in the summer of 1835 of typhoid fever at 22 years old. Lincoln's response to her death was, by the accounts of people around him, severe. He fell into a depression that his friends worried about. He became withdrawn and despondent in ways that were visible and concerning to the people who knew him. He recovered, in the sense that he continued to function and to work and to pursue his career, but something in the period after Anne Rutledge's death seems to have hardened into a recognition of what loss could do and how it felt and what it cost to survive it. This was not the first loss. His mother had been the first. His sister Sarah, whom he loved deeply and who had shared the terrible winter after their mother's death, had died in childbirth in 1828, when Lincoln was 19. The losses were accumulating in the particular way that losses accumulate when they happen to a person who is still young enough to be formed by them, laying down layers of knowledge about the specific texture of grief that would eventually give him something he could not have acquired any other way. He met Mary Todd in 1839 or 1840, at a dance or at the home of her sister where Springfield's social world gathered, and what began between them was one of the most complicated and most consequential relationships in American history. Mary Todd was not an easy woman to know. She was intelligent in a way that was unusual for women of her era and her class, educated beyond what was considered necessary, opinionated in a way that the conventions of her time and place would have preferred her not to be, and possessed of a temperament that was volatile in ways that Lincoln's was not, and that sometimes made the space between them difficult to navigate. She was from a Kentucky family of substantial social standing, which meant that she had arrived in Springfield with expectations about what her life would look like that the actual conditions of life with Abraham Lincoln would consistently fail to meet. She was capable of great tenderness and great pettiness in roughly equal measure, and the people who knew her well tended to have strong and polarized opinions about which quality was more fundamental. Lincoln and Mary Todd became engaged, and then, in circumstances that remain somewhat murky, the engagement was broken. Lincoln wrote a letter, or perhaps visited her in person, in January of 1841 to end the relationship, and the period that followed was one of the darkest of his life. He fell into a depression so severe that his friends removed all sharp objects from his vicinity out of genuine concern for what he might do with them. He described himself as the most miserable person alive. He could barely function. He recovered from this too, in the sense that he continued to exist and to work, and to eventually resume his relationship with Mary Todd, marrying her in November of 1842. But the Depression of 1841 was not simply a response to the broken engagement. It was a window into something in his psychological constitution that was always there, that would recur throughout his life, that he managed with varying degrees of success, and that shaped his public persona in ways that people who knew him recognized even when they could not fully name what they were seeing. He suffered from what he called the hypo, the hypochondria in the period's usage of the term, which meant not hypochondria in the modern sense of imagining physical illness, but something closer to what we would now recognize as clinical depression. The episodes were recurrent, and they were serious. Episodes of darkness in which the weight of everything accumulated to a point where functioning required a conscious effort that most people never have to make. He learned to manage it. The humor was part of the management. The storytelling was part of it. The work, the relentless, consuming engagement with the immediate problem in front of him, was probably the most important part of it. When there was a problem to solve, the depression had less room to operate. When the problem was solved, or the period between problems was too long, the darkness had more room. This is the interior landscape of the man who would eventually have to manage the most catastrophic problem in American history. The man who sat in the White House during the Civil War, making decisions whose consequences were measured in lives, was a man who had been fighting his own interior war for decades. He knew something about darkness. He knew something about the specific experience of continuing to function when the weight of everything made functioning feel impossible. That knowledge was not incidental to his leadership. It was central to it. The political career that eventually carried Abraham Lincoln to the White House was not a smooth trajectory. It was interrupted and redirected and apparently halted at multiple points by circumstances that a less persistent person would have accepted as final. He served 4 terms in the Illinois state legislature, beginning in 1834, and developed during those years the political skills and the political reputation that would eventually give him the platform to reach for larger things. He served 1 term in the United States House of Representatives beginning in 1847, distinguished himself primarily through his opposition to the Mexican-American War in ways that were politically costly in a district that expected its congressmen to support the war and declined to seek re-election when his term ended in 1849. He then practiced law for 5 years. These are the years that Lincoln biography tends to move through quickly, and they are worth slowing down for a moment, because they represent something that is easy to misread. They were not a period of failure or stagnation. They were a period of deepening, in which Lincoln developed the legal and intellectual skills that would eventually make him genuinely formidable in the national political arena. He took on complex cases. He argued before the Illinois Supreme Court with increasing frequency and increasing success. He became, by the early 1850s, one of the most capable and most respected lawyers in the state, a man whose opinion on legal questions carried real weight and whose practice was generating income that provided his family with a stability they had not previously had. He was also thinking, reading, following national events with the attention of a man who had not abandoned his interest in national politics, but who was waiting as a matter of practical judgment for the moment when re-entry made sense. That moment arrived in 1854 in the form of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. The Kansas-Nebraska Act, engineered by the Illinois Senator Stephen Douglas, opened previously closed territories to the possibility of slavery by repealing the Missouri Compromise, the agreement that had maintained a rough balance between slave and free states for 3 decades. The effect on Lincoln was galvanic. He described it himself as arousing him as he had never been aroused before. He threw himself back into political life with an energy and a focus that had a quality of urgency it had not previously had, because what was at stake now was something that went deeper than political advantage or career calculation. He believed that slavery was wrong. He had believed this for a long time, with the quiet certainty of a man who did not require external validation for his moral convictions. He had grown up in a Kentucky and Indiana and Illinois that were adjacent to slave society, and he had seen enough of what slavery actually looked like in practice to understand it without the abstractions that people who had never encountered it directly sometimes applied to it. He had floated down the Mississippi as a young man and seen slave markets in New Orleans and understood what he was looking at. He did not use the word evil casually, but when he described slavery, he used it. He had also believed pragmatically that the Constitution protected slavery where it already existed, and that the federal government did not have the authority to abolish it in the states where it was established. What he believed the government did have the authority and the obligation to do was to prevent its expansion into new territories, to hold the line against its spread while the existing institution slowly withered under the pressure of its own contradictions. The Kansas-Nebraska Act was a direct attack on this project. It opened the territories to slavery, and it represented the expansion of the institution rather than its containment. He entered the public debate about the act with speeches that are, even now, remarkable documents. The Peoria speech of October 1854 laid out an argument against slavery's expansion that combined moral clarity with constitutional precision in a way that few politicians of the era were capable of. It was not simply an emotional appeal, though it had genuine emotional force. It was a carefully constructed argument that engaged seriously with the opposing positions and that dismantled them not through rhetoric alone, but through logic. It demonstrated that the mind which had been sharpened on Blackstone and the Bible and Shakespeare for 30 years was now operating at a level of sophistication that the national political stage had not previously seen applied to this question. He ran for the Senate seat that Douglas held in 1858 and lost. The campaign produced the Lincoln-Douglas debates, 7 encounters across Illinois towns that attracted enormous audiences and that were reprinted in newspapers across the country, making both men nationally known in a way that transcended the Illinois Senate race they were technically about. Lincoln did not win the Senate seat. What he won was a national reputation, a clear articulation of the Republican position on slavery that would define the party's stance going forward, and a series of exchanges with Douglas that had demonstrated conclusively that he could hold his own in direct argument with one of the most skilled politicians in America. He was nominated by the Republican Party for the presidency in 1860 on the 3rd ballot at a convention in Chicago. The nomination was not the inevitable outcome of a clear frontrunner's march to victory. It was the product of specific strategic decisions made by his campaign managers, who understood that Lincoln's relative obscurity compared to the other major candidates was actually an asset in a convention where each of those candidates had made enemies that Lincoln had not yet had the opportunity to make. He won the general election in November 1860 with less than 40% of the popular vote, carrying every northern state but losing every southern state, some of which did not even put his name on the ballot. By the time he was inaugurated in March 1861, 7 southern states had already seceded and the Confederate States of America had already been organized, and Jefferson Davis was already serving as its president. The crisis that Lincoln had been elected to manage was not a crisis he had caused, but it was a crisis that had been building for decades around the central fault line of American life, and it fell to him to manage it precisely because his party had positioned itself as the alternative to the expansion of slavery, and the southern states had concluded that his election represented an existential threat to the institution on which their economy and their social structure rested. He had not run as an abolitionist. He had run on a platform of containing slavery's expansion rather than abolishing it where it existed. He had made his views about the wrongness of slavery clear, but had been equally clear about the limits of what he believed the federal government could do about it in the states where it was entrenched. None of this mattered to the Southern states, which understood that the long-term trajectory of a Republican presidency, even a moderate one, was the eventual end of slavery, and which chose secession over a future in which that trajectory would operate. The war that followed was the defining context of everything Lincoln did for the rest of his life. The White House that Lincoln moved into in March 1861 was a building that had not been designed to serve as the command center of a national war effort, and the presidency that he was assuming had not been designed to exercise the kind of executive authority that a national war would require. He had to invent much of what he did as he went, and the invention was contested at every step. Congressional leaders believed that Congress should direct the war effort. Military commanders believed that the president should defer to their professional judgment about how to fight it. Members of his own cabinet, several of whom had been his rivals for the nomination and who did not fully conceal their belief that they were more qualified for the office than he was, pursued their own agendas within the administration with varying degrees of transparency. He managed all of this with a patience and a political skill that was not always visible as skill because it operated through indirection and through the management of relationships rather than through the assertion of authority. He listened. He delayed decisions that did not need to be made immediately. He allowed people to express their views and to feel heard, and then he made the decision he had already determined was correct before the listening began. He was not passive in this. He was strategic, using the appearance of openness to gather information and to create the political conditions in which his decision would be accepted rather than resisted. He also managed an administration that was riven with personal conflicts, ideological disagreements, and competing ambitions, with a deftness that was not always recognized at the time but that became clearer in retrospect. His Secretary of State was William Seward, who had expected to be president himself, and who initially attempted to function as the actual executive of the administration with Lincoln as a kind of figurehead. Lincoln corrected this misunderstanding in a letter so quietly devastating in its precision that Seward never attempted it again, and subsequently became one of Lincoln's most loyal and capable allies. His Secretary of the Treasury was Salmon Chase, who actively sought the Republican nomination to replace Lincoln in 1864 while serving in his cabinet, and whom Lincoln kept in the cabinet because Chase was genuinely capable, and because having him inside the administration was safer than having him outside it agitating for Lincoln's removal. The management of the war itself was the central problem, and it was a problem that Lincoln had to solve, starting from a position of almost complete ignorance of military matters. He had served briefly in the militia during the Black Hawk War, a fact he mentioned in his characteristic self-deprecating style when asked about his military experience. What he knew about the conduct of actual war he had to learn after the war had already started, and he learned it with the same systematic thoroughness that had characterized every other area of knowledge he had needed to acquire throughout his life. He read military manuals, he studied maps, he developed over time a genuine strategic understanding of the war that often exceeded the understanding of the generals he was directing. The generals were a persistent problem. George McClellan, who commanded the Army of the Potomac for the first 2 years of the war, was a brilliant organizer and trainer of troops, and a deeply cautious battlefield commander who consistently found reasons not to fight when fighting was what the strategic situation required. Lincoln's relationship with McClellan was one of the most vexed and revealing of his presidency. McClellan held Lincoln in what amounted to contempt, referring to him in private correspondence as a guerrilla and a well-meaning baboon, and treating him with a condescension that Lincoln absorbed without visible reaction because the war required McClellan's organizational talents and the political situation made removing him prematurely costly. Eventually, the military situation made keeping him more costly than removing him, and Lincoln removed him twice, with a decisive patience that was characteristic of how he managed the most difficult personnel decisions of his presidency. He was also managing the political situation on the home front, which was as complicated in its own way as the military situation. The Republican Party contained within it a significant faction, the Radical Republicans, who believed that Lincoln was too cautious, too slow to move against slavery, too concerned with maintaining the border state's loyalty at the cost of the moral clarity that the moment required. They were not wrong about the tensions in his position, though they were often wrong about the political arithmetic that required him to navigate those tensions rather than simply ignoring them. He was managing the Democratic opposition, which included both people who believed the war was just, but that Lincoln was conducting it badly, and people who believed the war should not be fought at all, and that a negotiated peace with the Confederacy, which meant a peace that left slavery intact, was preferable to the continued slaughter. He was managing public opinion in northern states that were exhausted by 2 years of war and whose enthusiasm for continuing it was genuinely uncertain, particularly after the failures of 1862 and the appalling casualties of campaigns that seemed to lead nowhere. And he was managing his own family in a White House that was both a national institution and a private home, under conditions that made ordinary domestic life essentially impossible. The White House during the Civil War was not the protected and private space that the modern presidency occupies. It was accessible to the public in ways that seem almost incomprehensible from the perspective of current security practice. Lincoln held public office hours, receiving petitioners from all walks of life who wanted favors or appointments or pardons, or simply the chance to speak to the president. He called these interactions his public opinion baths, and while they consumed time and energy that he could not easily spare, he valued them as a way of maintaining his connection to the actual texture of American life outside Washington. His sons, Willie and Tad, lived in the White House and ran through its corridors and interrupted state occasions and kept goats on the lawn and brought general chaos to a building that was trying to function simultaneously as a private home and the executive center of a nation at war. Lincoln tolerated and encouraged this with the particular delight in his children's presence that had been visible in him since his Springfield years, when neighbors had noted that he was capable of being so absorbed in his children's play that he seemed to forget entirely where he was and what he was supposed to be doing. Willie died in February of 1862. He was 11 years old, and he died of typhoid fever in the White House, while his parents sat with him, and the loss was devastating in a way that few things in Lincoln's life had been devastating in quite that specific way. Mary Lincoln, whose relationship with grief was never uncomplicated, collapsed under it entirely, entering a period of mourning so extreme and so prolonged that she stopped functioning in the normal rhythms of her life for months. Lincoln's response was different in its expression but no less profound in its depth. He went to a room alone and wept. He had Willie's body disinterred twice so he could look at his son's face. He spoke of his son in ways that made clear that the loss was not something he would recover from in any simple sense, but something he would carry forward, adding it to the stack of losses he had been carrying since he was 9 years old. The losses kept accumulating even as the work continued, and the work continued even as the losses accumulated. This is perhaps the most remarkable thing about Lincoln's presidency when you look at it closely. The sheer number of things he was managing simultaneously, the military situation, the political situation, the diplomatic situation with European powers that were contemplating recognizing the Confederacy, the internal divisions of his party, the external opposition of the Democrats, the grief of his wife, the grief of a nation, his own grief, his own recurring depression, all of it at once, all of it every day for 4 years. He kept working. The Emancipation Proclamation was the product of 18 months of political and moral calculation that is sometimes simplified into the narrative of Lincoln suddenly discovering his moral compass. The reality was considerably more complex and considerably more interesting. Lincoln had been moving toward emancipation as a war measure since the early months of the conflict, understanding it as something that would both undermine the Confederate economy, which was built on enslaved labor, and encourage enslaved people themselves to flee to Union lines where their labor and eventually their military service would strengthen the Union war effort. He waited for a Union military victory before issuing it, because Seward had correctly advised him that issuing the proclamation after a string of Union defeats would make it look like a desperate measure rather than a position of strength. The victory at Antietam in September 1862, the bloodiest single day in American military history, provided the occasion. He issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation on September 22, 1862, giving Confederate states 100 days to return to the Union before the proclamation took effect, and when no Confederate state did so, issued the final proclamation on January 1, 1863. The proclamation did not free all enslaved people. It freed only those in states in rebellion, exempting the border states and the areas of Confederate states already under Union control. It was carefully constructed to stay within what Lincoln understood as his constitutional authority, the power of the commander-in-chief to take measures necessary for the military suppression of the rebellion, rather than claiming a broader authority to abolish slavery everywhere that he did not believe the Constitution granted him. The abolitionists were disappointed by its limits. History has been more generous to its strategic intelligence. By framing emancipation as a war measure within his existing constitutional authority, Lincoln made it politically defensible to audiences that would not have accepted it as a moral absolute. By limiting its immediate application, he maintained the loyalty of the border states, whose continued membership in the Union he correctly identified as essential to winning the war. And by putting emancipation into the war's explicit purpose, rather than leaving it as an implicit consequence, he transformed the meaning of what the Union was fighting for in ways that made European recognition of the Confederacy politically impossible, and that gave enslaved people themselves a clear signal about what a Union victory would mean. He knew what he was doing. He had been thinking about it for longer than most people around him understood. The election of 1864 was the moment when the question of whether the democracy could sustain itself under the pressure of a catastrophic war was answered. Lincoln fully expected to lose. He said so privately. The war was going badly in the summer of 1864. The casualties of the Overland Campaign, Grant's grinding offensive through Virginia that was costing tens of thousands of lives without producing the decisive result that the North desperately needed, had exhausted public patience to a point where Lincoln's re-election seemed genuinely uncertain. The Democratic candidate, George McClellan, was running on a platform that, while not explicitly calling for peace at any price, left open the possibility of a negotiated settlement that would have left slavery intact. Lincoln prepared a document, which he had members of his cabinet sign without showing them its contents, in which he acknowledged that he would probably lose the election, and committed himself to cooperating with his successor in saving the Union between the election and the inauguration. He sealed the document in an envelope. He was preparing himself concretely and practically for the possibility of defeat. Sherman's capture of Atlanta in September 1864 changed the political situation and almost certainly saved the election. The fall of Atlanta demonstrated that the Union war effort was succeeding, that the strategy of relentless pressure was working, and that the end was within reach if the North simply sustained its will. Lincoln won the election decisively, carrying most of the northern states and, in the provision for soldiers voting in the field, winning a substantial majority of the military vote. His second inaugural address, delivered on March 4, 1865, is the document that most clearly shows what 4 years of war and loss and the specific experience of carrying the weight of a nation through its worst crisis had made of Abraham Lincoln. It is short, only 703 words, and it contains almost none of the triumphalist rhetoric that a leader on the verge of military victory might have been expected to offer. Instead, it is a meditation on the meaning of the war and on the responsibility that came with winning it. A meditation shaped by a moral and theological seriousness that surprised people who had expected a victory speech and received something much harder and much more honest. He did not claim that God was on the Union's side. He acknowledged that both sides had prayed to the same God, and that neither side's prayers had been answered in the way that side had hoped. He suggested that the war itself might be understood as God's punishment for the sin of slavery, a punishment visited on both the enslaved and the enslaver, on both North and South, as the price of a sin that the nation as a whole had permitted and sustained. This was not a comfortable argument. It was the argument of a man who had been living with the weight of the war's casualties for 4 years, and who had been thinking, in the long watches of White House nights, about what it meant and what it required. with malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in. He was describing a project of reconstruction that he understood would be as difficult as the war itself, and he was trying to establish, in the few hundred words of the inaugural address, the moral framework within which it should be conducted. Not vengeance, not punishment of the defeated South, but reunion, genuine reunion, attempted with the understanding that the people who had fought against the Union were Americans, and that the task of bringing them back into the national community was a task that required generosity rather than retribution. He did not live to attempt it. John Wilkes Booth shot Abraham Lincoln at Ford's Theatre on the evening of April 14, 1865, 5 days after Lee's surrender at Appomattox. Lincoln died the following morning, April 15, 1865, in a boarding house bedroom across the street from the theatre, having never regained consciousness after the shooting. He was 56 years old. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, standing at the bedside, said, "Now he belongs to the ages. It is a remarkable sentence for a remarkable moment, and it has proved accurate in ways that Stanton could not have fully anticipated. Lincoln does belong to the ages. His image is on the currency and the mountain and the memorial at the end of them all. His words are quoted in political speeches across the ideological spectrum, often by people who hold positions he would not have recognized as his own, because the words are capacious enough to accommodate many interpretations, and because the interpretations say as much about the people doing the interpreting as they do about Lincoln. But tonight, we have been trying to find the man underneath the monument, and the man is worth finding on his own terms. He was formed by loss, by the specific, recurring, comprehensive experience of people and things being taken away before he was finished with them. His mother at 9, his sister at 19, Anne Rutledge at 26, Willie at 53, and always, throughout, the recurring descent into the depression that he called the Hypo, and that was its own form of loss, the temporary disappearance of the capacity for the ordinary satisfactions that sustain most people through most of their lives. He was formed by poverty, by the specific experience of living without the resources that make education and opportunity and the pursuit of what you are actually capable of possible, and of having to create those resources through the brute force of his own extraordinary intelligence working on whatever materials the frontier happened to provide. He read by firelight because he had no other light. He borrowed books because he could not afford to buy them. He taught himself law from borrowed volumes because there was no law school available to him and no money to attend one if there had been. He was formed by physical displacement, by the particular experience of moving repeatedly, of never quite having a place that was permanently and securely his, of building his life through a series of temporary habitations until Springfield became something approaching a permanent home, and then of leaving Springfield for Washington and the White House, which was the most displaced place of all, a building that belonged to the nation rather than to him, and in which the ordinary comforts of a private life were essentially unavailable. And he was formed by the democracy he served, by the specific and demanding experience of having to make his case to people who were not required to agree with him, of having to earn trust and support through the quality of his arguments and the clarity of his character, rather than through birth or wealth or any other form of inherited advantage. The prairie communities where he developed his abilities were communities of people who judged a man by what he could actually do, and what Lincoln could actually do, once people had the opportunity to observe it, was genuinely impressive. The combination of these formative experiences produced something unusual, a man of extraordinary intelligence and extraordinary patience, a man who understood loss from the inside and who had found, through the long process of surviving it, a quality of compassion that was not sentimental but was real. A man who could see multiple perspectives on a question not because he lacked conviction, but because he had spent enough time with real complexity to know that most important questions resist simple resolution. A man who could hold contradictions in his mind without resolving them prematurely, who could maintain the tension between what was morally right and what was politically possible for long enough to find the moments when those two things could be moved closer together. He was not perfect. He was not the marble president. He held views about race that were products of his time and his context, views that evolved significantly over his lifetime, but that never fully escaped the assumptions of the world that formed him. He made mistakes. He was sometimes too slow and sometimes too fast, and always too aware of the gap between what he wanted to do and what the political situation would allow him to do, which was an awareness that people who wanted him to be more heroic in the straightforward sense sometimes experienced as a moral failing rather than a political reality. But what he did do, in the specific historical moment that was his to navigate, was remarkable by any measure. He held the Union together through the worst crisis in American history. He freed, through the Emancipation Proclamation and through his advocacy for the 13th Amendment, 4 million people from slavery. He left behind a set of words in the Gettysburg Address and the Second Inaugural and the letters and the speeches that constitute his written legacy that are among the finest pieces of American prose ever produced and that still carry genuine meaning for people who encounter them without the scaffold of historical obligation. He did all of this while managing the interior war of his own depression and his own grief and his own relentless capacity to feel the weight of what was happening around him. He did it while managing a marriage that was genuinely difficult and genuinely important and genuinely his. He did it while being the father of sons he loved with a completeness that was visible to everyone who observed him with them. He did it while telling stories and laughing at himself and finding, in the specific genius of his humor, a way of bearing what would otherwise have been unbearable. Here is what I keep coming back to when the story of Lincoln settles into its quieter register. He was not waiting to be a great man. He was not positioned from birth, by wealth or by family or by the advantages of privilege for the role that history assigned him. He was a poor boy from a log cabin on the Kentucky frontier who lost his mother at 9 and his sister at 19 and who had almost no formal education and who had to build everything he became from whatever raw materials the world happened to put in his path. What made him was the loss and the response to the loss, the refusal to be destroyed by it, the determination to continue, not in the triumphalist way of someone who has transcended their pain and emerged stronger, but in the more honest way of someone who carries the pain forward and learns from it something about what other people's pain feels like, something about the specific texture of being human in a world that is not organized around your comfort or your survival. The compassion that defined his presidency was not a natural gift. It was a product, produced by the accumulated experience of loss and displacement and the long effort of self-formation undertaken by a person who had to build himself from nothing because nothing was what he started with. And the ambition that drove him was not the simple ambition of a man who wanted power for its own sake. It was something more complicated and more interesting. It was the ambition of a person who could see, from very early on, the gap between what his abilities were and what his circumstances allowed, and who spent his entire life trying to close that gap, not for himself alone, but because he had a genuine sense, clear and persistent and not simply rhetorical, that what he could do mattered beyond his own life. He was right about that. What he did mattered beyond his own life. It mattered enormously, and it matters still, in ways that are contested and complicated and alive in ways that truly important things always are. What made him, in the ways that matter most, made you too. The loss that forms you is not the same loss. The poverty is probably not the same poverty. The displacement is probably not the same displacement. But the experience of being shaped by things you did not choose, of having to build something of yourself from whatever materials the world provides rather than from the materials you would have selected, of finding in the hardest things that have happened to you the raw material for the person you are capable of becoming, that is not specific to the Kentucky frontier in 1809. That is us. That is the work that all of us are doing, in our different registers and at our different scales, every day. Let the story of Abraham Lincoln settle into wherever stories settle in you tonight. Not as a list of dates and battles and legislative achievements, though all of those things are real and worth knowing. Not as a symbol to be deployed in arguments about what America is or should be, though the symbol is real too and not without its uses, but as a human story, about a person who was formed by things he did not choose and who made something extraordinary from those things. Not through the simple mechanism of triumph over adversity, but through the more complicated and more honest mechanism of carrying the adversity forward and allowing it to teach him something about the experience of being human that he could not have learned any other way. Let the losses speak for what they were, real losses. Nancy Lincoln in the Indiana autumn, Sarah in childbirth, Anne Rutledge in the summer fever, Willie in the White House while the war went on outside. Let them be real rather than simply background to the achievement. Let the achievement speak for itself because it was genuinely extraordinary and does not need to be inflated to be remarkable. And let the man rest. He was tired. He said so in the days after Lee's surrender, with a quality of exhaustion that went beyond the physical. The exhaustion of a person who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and who has finally been permitted to set it down, and who finds that the setting down brings not simply relief, but something closer to a different kind of weight, the weight of everything that was carried and everything that the carrying cost. He was looking forward in those last days to what came next, to going back to Illinois, to returning to the law, to the ordinary life that the presidency had interrupted and that he genuinely missed in its ordinariness. He never got there. The fire is low. The night is long. He moved for so long and carried so much and never quite got to stop. Rest now. Good night.